All right, thank you all. So to get us started, what I'd like to consider is, some of you have mentioned certain technologies that use a certain bit of machine learning on their back end, such as Fitbits or whatever. Others of you have mentioned things that might be ripe for some of this use, but currently, I know, for instance, you're just starting to work at Wave on automating a very human process right now. So, and then there are areas where people don't really think. So like I noticed, just to plug Microsoft a little bit, our wonderful sponsor, for me as someone who has dyslexia, in the last couple of months, Microsoft Word has finally started to understand my intent with my spelling. And one of the reasons is because they recently hit a switch that turned their, how the spell checker works to be looking, it's artificial intelligence looking at a ridiculous amount of written language enabled by internet and other things. And it's finally learning how to help me spell. And I think a lot of other people understand that too. So that's, you know, one of those low-hanging, what considered low-hanging fruit. We have that technology, but it's actually much better with that going on in the background. And then we have other things that are maybe, I know you're using schedulers with your patients that are using artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to help them plan their week and their day based on importance of tasks instead of just slotting things into time slots. So those are examples of a more forward application and more back end. So if we could just maybe go through, maybe start with Sharon, and talk about where the AI implication is in what you talked about.
Well, first of all, part of the, in order to create a quality methodology to make sure you're assessing skills properly, is you need to have I think the future is going to be some gamification where you can actually have, or using virtual reality, where you can actually truly test people's knowledge. I mean, right now you have resumes. People are hiring people off of resumes, but it doesn't mean they really have the depth of knowledge or problem-solving skills. And of course, when you look at a resume, you already have bias built into it. So what we're looking at is we've created a methodology where, and built into our software, we actually can get granular on somebody's skill set. But nonetheless, a lot of it is still sort of verbal behavioral questioning. But the future is going to be is how do we take that and create real life situations in the company. I know some companies are doing this already, where the person is actually in a virtual reality situation and actually making real decisions about working in that place. And then you know, wow, that person really has the knowledge and skills that I need. And that's going to tremendously help our aging populations to take that bias out of it, or anyone, and even anyone who has a disability, because then you're purely judging that person on their ability to do the work. And so that's going to become significant down the road. And you know, there's a whole big conversation out in corporate America already about why there's not enough diversity across everything, from disabled people to elderly to you know, your racial background, for women included, women can vote. Anyway. I think that's going to be a huge, hugely helpful in what we're doing in the future to make sure that there is no bias toward a person who has disabilities or to a person who's 75 years old and still very, very capable of contributing to our society.
So Ariana, how do we do that? How do we make that vision happen?
Well, that's a great vision.
Put you right on the spot.
Yeah, okay. So one thing that I'm really excited about in the work that I'm doing is that we're using AI to build this system that's going to train humans, which is kind of what you're saying. How do we better leverage humans? What I'm concerned about is developing systems that, instead of creating diversity in the workplace, kind of like pigeonhole people. And so it's interesting. I think we have to walk the line of where opaque systems remove transparency so that we can't see the equal vision happen. And so I think when we get to training, I think that's a great opportunity. But we have to be careful, I think, about like selecting people. And ranking and stuff like that. And so I think, and also I think an interesting thing about how we use AI to, like in your company is also to think about the difference between AI versus computer systems, just using a computer, and statistics. And thinking about when we actually need an artificial agent or what AI is. And I think separating that can be very useful because sometimes you just need a computer to make something faster. And that, I don't know, conflating those things I think can be challenging and a problem because if you just need a computer to help people do something and then you replace it with a system that, as we all know and we're seeing, can introduce a lot of bias and introduce a lot of inequality, then we're kind of getting off towards this vision.
Mm-hmm. And I think for the VA, you're doing a lot to help people achieve goals that they've communicated, but also you're introducing things that control how they achieve those goals. It enables, but it also is not maybe as broad a set of choices. How do you deal with that? How do you work that in? What do you see going on there?
So in a rehab, we definitely want to be able to enhance our traditional rehab model through the use of technology. So we've explored some smart home devices such as the Echo, the Alexa, Google Home. Diksha talks a little bit about the smart home technology. As we move into our new rehab building, we want to be able to trial some of that technology, and also through the use of wearables as well, to be able to monitor and intervene whenever there's a change in someone's health.
And a machine is often deciding whether or not a clinician sees that as a change versus just part of the data stream.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Did you want to add to that?
No, I think one of the things that's important to point out when we're working with our patients and trying to identify what technology works for them is it's an iterative process. So for some patients, they prefer iPads, some prefer iPhones, some don't want any of them, and they like the Apple Watch that can just send them a quick reminder and it's discreet. So we really work with our patient populations to find out what works for them and then also teach them.
Are they all Apple products, or do you have?
No, those are just examples. So we use Samsung. We use a few of them, but we have partnered with Apple and Google in the past to kind of work on some of these projects and initiatives that we have. And it's important that we teach our patients to advocate for themselves and really use these technologies to help enhance their goals and not use them as a crutch almost.
So Bob, I mean, that raises an interesting point of we could follow a system. That system might attend to our needs and our desires, you know, our long-term goals and our learning requirements, and help us get to matching a set environment. But how does that become more dynamic as we develop? Those goals might change. Those requirements might change. The world might change.
Absolutely.
So,
and I want to build up what you said about having the learners be their own best self-advocates, right? So if we create this cycle of dependence, we're imagining the AI gets so good, and it's certainly not there yet, where it can really determine what's the next best thing for me to learn. It's so disempowering, right? And it's perhaps taking away the most important thing that I can contribute as a human to long-term problem solving. So the best ideas, I think, are the ones where we're looking at more of a scaffolding environment. How can we provide as supports for the learner that the learner has some say over, some control over, or a lot of say and control over, and gradually, the idea of gradually diminishing them over time. And so empowering the learners to more actively reach out for the types of supports that they need, as opposed to being told, this is the support you need now.
And how do I discover those supports?
A lot of trial and error. I mean, how do we learn about ourselves as learners? It's largely trial and error. So you know, there's a big conflict. It's one thing to have trial and error when I'm in a classroom. It's another to be in a job, on the floor of a factory making mistakes. So that's always going to be a huge challenge there. But it is how we as humans learn.
Okay. Do we have questions? Josh.
Sharon, I'm curious about the sort of the dynamic, the dual problem of providing sort of this blind employment opportunity where people can't be discriminated against based on their age or what they look like,
Right.
And also the idea of hiding these people. So you're not actually so there's the opportunity to shift perception is lost in this. Can you comment on it?
Well, it's not that, I mean, I wouldn't say that they're hiding. What it is that because once they communicate and they're working for somebody, they recognize, you know, the knowledge that they have. I mean, so the concept of blind hiring is, and in our case, it's even further than just blind hiring. The concept as it's used in corporate America is that you assess the skills first before you ever see the resume. Then you see them in person. And so you get, let's say, the 3 or 4 best people, but then once you meet them, you're not aware of your own internal bias, that all of a sudden that one gets it instead of the other. In our situation, we don't allow them to Skype anybody, so we don't want them to see anyone because we feel that will make a difference, and that might influence the judgment of which person to hire. So it's strictly a phone interview that we help set up and prepare, and then they know we've already vetted everything, that we've checked references, we really did a deep dive into all their skills and qualified them, and we also did a deep dive into the employer and qualified the employer. So, I mean, that's why it takes, it takes sort of not just the bias out of it, but it purely focuses on the person as a whole person, not just the skills, but how they, it's also about personality and culture and what you want to do. So, I mean, we ask all kinds of questions, like, what do you want to do now? You know, some people say after so many years in a career, they want to do something simple. You know, they don't want to do something complex. So, so it's really about the entire person, its skills, and how you best match that using AI. We have great algorithms that put together the best of all the things that we ask on both sides of the scale. I don't know if that totally answers your question.
All right, so we have a question. It says for Bob,
Okay.
So we'll let you start. But I think this actually is a question for everyone, because in our discussions leading up to this panel, I think you're all struggling with where this point is and how to do it. So what is the role of human instructors, or might we just say humans? I know, Oriana, that's like a big part of what you're doing. What should be automated and artificial, and what should be human to human? In a world where intelligent tutors are ubiquitous, will it augment? Will it replace? I think those are 2 very different questions, because one has a lot of policy wrapped into it, where another might be a judgment of what might be most appropriate. So let's start with that first question. Where is the role of humans in this training and learning environment? So,
sure. So I'm not ready to give up on the social aspects of learning. I do a lot of my work in K-12 education and public education. I think the best thing we can do right now is to empower teachers with better data about how students are doing, what's working, what's not working, and better tools to deal with this information. So I do a lot of work in formative assessment, empowering teachers with data and information about how to use the data to make good instructional decisions. So what content to give students, what supports to give students, how much challenge is the right amount of challenge, how to identify when a student is in challenge mode versus in overload mode, right? So I'm doing a lot of work with recommendations engines for teachers, but also understanding that teachers don't all learn in the same way and don't all react in the same way. So there has to be a lot of flexibilities in these systems. So a lot of work I'm doing now is designing dashboards for teachers that are intuitive and allow teachers time to understand this new way of understanding the students.
I love this question. I think it's great.
Did you write it?
I think that's really important, and I think that's a great question. Like, I'm excited to hear other people's opinion. I think that gets back to what I was saying. I think we have to think very carefully about what the role is, and probably it will be different for a lot of settings. Personally, I do not think that replacing humans is a good idea. So I love these ideas about providing, like, I think about providing tools for mental health providers, and it sounds like you're providing tools for educators, and that's wonderful. And even when we provide tools, we have to be careful, I think, about providing, it's the concept of an echo chamber from online media, but you can provide an echo chamber in its sense similar of like what somebody's capabilities are. So I learned at 14, these were your capabilities, and these are gonna be carried through forever, even just through high school or something. So I think the role is probably going to be very tailored to the instance, and I think it's going to be very limited to a tool to make humans better. So maybe selecting something that this is, you know, needs to be suggestions of this needs to be addressed first, or maybe order something, but be very careful that it doesn't get us into stagnant environments.
And I would add, I think it will be augmented, and I look at my demographic, and one of the big issues, which Governor Granholm had mentioned earlier, is that all our retraining programs have failed, the traditional retraining programs for new skills, and I think that AI and virtual reality is going to be an amazing boon to retraining, and of course it's going to take humans to create that virtual reality. How do you do something? How do you retrain someone to fulfill a job that they've never done before? I mean, you can read about it, but you don't get the 4 or 5 years experience you need to get good on the job. But if you have someone who designs virtual reality for you, that you actually have real life experience over a period of time and it's your individual learning, because it's going to go by how fast each person does it. It doesn't mean one person is necessarily smarter than the other, but having been a teacher in my past life, children and adults learn differently. Some are visual, some need to have multi-sense approach. And so I think that will transform how we take some of our older workers who are let go because they said, oh, you're too old, and now there isn't a job for them, and how will we retrain them and make them economically viable and feel that they're still fulfilled and have a meaningful life. So I think AI and virtual reality is going to change that entire process of how we retool people and how they learn a new occupation.
Mm-hmm. So I previously had a startup that was focused on virtual reality and mental health care. And we started with the ask was around a lot of simulation. How could we spread a therapist further? And one of the things we found was providing, because of the variation in both patients and therapists and how they progress and how they prefer to work, was to provide a playground that was enabled by certain machine learning as well as other types of technologies, including VR. But was really an environment that they could easily and in real time manipulate and recreate and not have to plan ahead, and just really move their work into that environment, and that environment with its augmentations that we couldn't do in the real world provided a lot of value. And that our ability to extend for the therapist wasn't as extreme as we were hoping, but what it did do is improve rapport building, the amount of time it took. Mm-hmm. It allowed people to focus as patients, so we shortened the process, but we didn't actually manage, which I'm glad, is personal bias, not to get rid of the therapist, but we weren't able to move the therapist more to a supervisory role. We deepened and changed how they interact, and that was an interesting thing, and a market problem. That kind of had an effect on our company. So there's an example of where these things still, there's always a give and a take. Yeah. A pure simulation, you can do that for a little bit of time of the day, and then it can get kind of, you need other things, and we interact with people. So starting with the two of you, this is a great question, because I think it gets us out of everyone always has a starting point when they think about pathways to work. They might be, if you're in Silicon Valley, you might think about knowledge workers being displaced, or professionals, or getting people into those roles. We heard before so much about industry and factory work, but when we say retraining in our white paper, we put parentheses around the re. What about people who don't have access, or who were in a workplace and lost that access? So this question is, how can AI be used to end veteran homelessness? Now, a very broad question, but if we bring that into a big part of that, how do you have the stability, and how does work relate to that, and how do we get to there, and how do we maintain that?
That's a difficult question.
It is. It's big, but I think it's a great one to bring all these things together.
Concept, right. Homelessness. So are we talking more about finding work, keeping them employed?
Well, I think the question is where does those things fit in the homelessness equation? Mm-hmm. Is it just about finding people shelter? It's a holistic thing that you talk about. So maybe you could inform us a little bit about all the components that have to go into allowing someone to be in that self-sufficient state.
So with our homeless population, absolutely, we first want to prioritize, obviously, placement. So at the VA hospital, we have several residential programs, as well as community partnerships where we try to find them housing. So in addition to the housing, we also focus on vocational rehabilitation, where we're training our patients to learn new skills or enhance some of their skills to be able to return to work, find some type of meaningful activities, work or school. So in our outpatient program, we see that the average age, mid-20s, mid-30s. So a lot of our veterans actually want to go back to school. So they were in the military 10, 15 years, and they actually want to go back to school. And they're trying to figure out, what do I want to do? I wanted to be a police officer, but because of my injuries, I'm not able to do that type of work anymore. So really exploring, what are their interests, what do they want to do, and what type of training is needed in order to get them there. So part of our homeless programs, we do focus on not only the housing piece of it, but also the employment. We assist with resumes, we assist with actual job coaching. So we have different levels of programs specific to employment.
And when do we start kicking in, or where do you see the potential to start kicking in these AI and machine learning opportunities? So one might be around the data. At what point does that become more personal? Can we start at the very beginning, give someone a phone and be like, hey, here you go? Or is there setting events where...
So I think with that, it's important to make sure that the patient as a whole is okay health-wise, right? So that's our main focus, is ensuring that their mental health and all of that is okay. And after that, I think we can really focus on using technology, but I don't think giving them an iPhone or an iPad right away is going to be beneficial to them. We found that on-the-job training is the best for them. We have various programs throughout our healthcare system, including the compensated work therapy program, where they're actually paid to do jobs like throughout our healthcare system and things like that. So I think working technology in that route would probably be the best route, instead of just giving them, an iPhone or an iPad and saying, figure it out. So really kind of integrating both of those. And, we're working our way there, but it's a work in progress.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
Just want to add on just that what makes it especially complicated is that part of getting our health back is feeling fulfilled. And a lot of that is getting back to work.
Right.
So, and I think you're realizing that more over time. That's not just a matter of, well, wait till you're 100%, then start figuring out what's next, but rather they have to be woven together.
Yeah. So it seems this problem, as you described it, very complex. I don't want to minimize it, but it seems if we all represent, not say just us on this, but if we all represent the domains and the capacity that our industries and our areas of work bring to it, it seems like this is actually a solvable problem, looking at it from a human perspective and not. So what are the policy, what do we need to be able to allow a group like us, and who we'd bring into it, to just go ahead and solve this problem?
I think that's the purpose of this conference, right?
Yes, it is.
We have to answer that now, or can we do that in the next?
Well, I mean, I'd like to just solve the problem right now in front of all of you, and be poof, here we go. That's how it works at Citrus, on our upper floors. So here's another question that I think is very interesting as we think about how technology becomes, we start to live in a technological world where we are all at some sort of deficit in time. How do we not become cogs to the machine? There is a long history of, as protections and opportunities for work decline, that humans are asked to fulfill a role that is the most likely to be automated, but is not the cheapest to do next. So moving data from one system to another, moving apart from one system to another. Interesting, as we look at Amazon service centers, the warehouses, we see a lot of retired individuals whose pensions aren't covering it going back to work, and they're the first real group of people who are allowed to work hand-to-hand with robots. Because in most cases where we've had robots, they were kept in a cage for our safety And now we are working with them, and they're deciding what we need to do to help them. And so in relation to that, it also is, how does this become ubiquitous? How do things get paid for? How do we all end up with it? So the question is, individual ownership over our own bodies is already theoretically established. How do we extend that sort of privacy and ownership to essential assistive technologies? So and there we go with some of that crazy.
Somebody.
Oh, does that mean time up?
That means we're out of time.
All right. So enough to answer this question. So how do we extend this idea? We have domain over our own bodies. We're supposedly own our own bodies. And now we have all these extensions through AI and things. How do we apply that same sort of privacy and ownership to essential assistive and other technologies? And I'll add to this question, is it too late?
That's a big question. Well, I don't believe anything's too late. I mean, I just think there's always a solution to a problem if we put our best minds to it and if we change policy. So I'm never a fatalist. I always think there's if there's a problem, there's an opportunity to create something better. And so, I mean, I think that we can regain control. I mean, following a lot on blockchain, you look at Estonia and they're all on blockchain, and how that technology might help us reclaim our own identity. I mean, some people think it could be a problem, maybe, but maybe if we look at it in a way where we can make it not a problem. So I think there are technologies and other things that will come into play that will help us regain. And maybe we will be able to, if we have our own blockchain of identity, say, okay, Facebook, you now owe me this amount of money for this amount of verified information about me. And then you get automatically paid. So, I don't know, but that's a possibility.
I think, bringing it back to the whole domain of learning again, and I think we have to police ourselves and make sure that we're never designing learning situations just to get to a specific set of end goals. So we need you as a cog to fit in this way, so we're going to train you to how to fit into that cog. We have to always make sure there's something beyond that. And that's what you're striving for. Because what's beyond that is where you, as a human, are going to be able to be at your best, most empowered, most creative, most out of the box. So that's one of the challenges of all the learning standards that we have. So often we target our students to hit those standards, and that should not be the trajectory. The trajectory should be beyond, always beyond.
I heard it posited that the problems are not with tech, but all the tech problems are social problems. And I think that's very true. Like, is it a problem that the government doesn't own Facebook? Maybe that's the problem. Not Facebook is doing this, right? They're acting as a company. But this is related, I think, to the idea, like, I'm sorry to pull these other potentially off-topic examples, but I think we can extend it to, like, to this, where we have to approach, I think, often these as social problems and not forget, as you're saying, this is echoing what you're saying, that it is a social problem, and we can't just offload it to the tech and be like, oh, some new tech is going to come along and save our lives, but we have to address this as problems that we've had with other things in the past. And I think that's very important.
And it's an ecosystem problem. I was about to say, when I am asked to design specifically assistive technology, privacy is just a default. But now I realize, well, we involve Google Maps. We involve all these third-party services that we really can't do on our own. The VR company I mentioned, that was a $80 million lift by the Department of Defense to develop the platform that allowed us to do that work, because we couldn't raise that money. And these are issues as we start to share services and make things more integrated, which makes it easier to create pathways, but harder to control what happens with that. Recently, we have a project at Citrus called Percept, which is studying what would happen if we what would be necessary to start prescribing in healthcare third-party apps that connect to the health system. And one of the things we immediately found was our step tracker that was being prescribed had its own terms of use that we had no control over, and it could change at any time. And that was in a healthcare setting where we actually have protections in place. What happens in the workplace where the protections are maybe not up to date enough? Yeah. So any last If we want to just bring us home, Bob?
Do we have time for one more question, or will there be an opportunity later?
There'll be opportunity to continue this discussion, and this is just like with the white paper, it's the beginning of a broader discussion. One of the main goals of Citrus is as a convener, and we like to start by developing a group. So we're more at the beginning, even though we've been doing this work for almost a year privately. Now it's going public, and we want to continue these efforts. So there's opportunities today to continue the discussion with the people who are here, but we also want you to come up to us with your ideas of what sort of opportunities we should be making possible. So thank you all.
Okay. Thank you.